understand Mr Parker, he was talking about the National Party.
No, I've already ruled.
I've
already ruled, and I'm inviting the member to continue.
Mr. Speaker, how do you value your word? How do you value your word? I value my word highly. The National Party obviously does not value theirs. They promised before the election they would not increase GST. This budget increases GST. Their second promise, they would not increase borrowing for tax cuts. They would not borrow for tax cuts. That promise is broken. They are borrowing, their borrowing increases as a consequence of the tax cuts in this budget. The second broken promise. The third broken promise is that they weren't going to cut public services. They promised in particular, explicitly, that they would not cut early childhood education. In fact, they would make it free. What do they do in this budget? Audrey Young picks this up in her column today. In her thing today, she says they're going to save about $400 million in 4 years by abolishing the top 2 funding rates for early childhood centres. That means for the parents a decrease in the subsidy they get for their children, in those cases of about $25 per child per week. $25 per child per week. That is the third broken promise. Amy Adams says that's not a broken promise. You do not know what a promise is. You do not know what a promise is.
Order.
Mr. Speaker, the other thing that needs to be said in respect of these changes to income tax, we know that the projection as to the rate of inflation as a consequence of these changes is that next year inflation will be 5.9%. 5.9%. So for the income tax cuts that people get to compensate them for the increase in GST, all but the most wealthy have that eaten up as a consequence of the increase in the prices they pay when they go to the supermarket. So rather than being some great boon to them, the money is gobbled up by an increase of their cost of living. Their rents are going to go up, their supermarket costs are going to go up, all of their costs are going to go up. We heard Amy Adams saying this is fair because this is fairly distributed. 41% of the income tax benefits go to the top 10% of income earners. 41% go to the people who already earn the most. 41%. Now, New Zealand already has low income tax rates for high earners. That is set out in the Tax Working Group paper, which was produced on behalf of the government, and they said this: the current New Zealand top personal rate at 38% is not especially high by OECD standards. It was already low by OECD standards, and you're cutting it further for the top 10% of income earners who pick up 40%, the top 10% of income earners pick up 41% of the decrease in income tax. It's just not fair. I want to say something about the rebalancing of the economy. The government said this was all about rebalancing the economy, and the Tax Working Group said that we did need to rebalance the economy away from speculative investment in housing towards the productive sector. And in the Labour Party, we agree with that. We agree with that as an ambition. Up until today, we were all expecting that there would be ring-fencing of losses so that people can't reduce their personal income tax by buying some residential property and offsetting the interest costs on the loss that they make on that rental property to show to decrease their personal income overall. And what have they done? They've backed away from that. That's one of the disappointments that Bernard Hickey has, and he's right, because it doesn't rebalance the economy away from speculative investment in the housing sector. People can still make those investments in the residential property sector, incur a big mortgage, reduce and offset that against their personal income tax. So rather than closing that loophole, they've gone a little bit of the way. They've actually said, well, you can't deduct your depreciation on buildings that are they're going to last more than 50 years, and that's a fair enough step. I don't criticise that, but they haven't taken the more important step of ring-fencing those losses. What have they done about catching up with Australia? Well, the answer is nothing. The answer is nothing. The growth rates in New Zealand projected for the years out are lower than the growth rates that are predicted in Australia, so the gap continues to grow between New Zealand and Australia. The wage gap between New Zealand and Australia will continue to grow ever bigger, and this budget does absolutely nothing to reverse that trend. What have they done in terms of encouraging smart business? They've cut depreciation rates that businesses can claim for investments in high-tech plant and equipment. Cut depreciation rates, so they're going in exactly the opposite way there. Fran O'Sullivan, I thought, wrote a very good column in the Herald a couple of weeks ago. It might be about a month ago now, and she said, given high rates of youth unemployment in New Zealand, and given our experience last time we had high rates of youth unemployment, particularly Maori Pacific Island unemployment, last time we had that in New Zealand was in the 1990s under the Bolger government, under the Bolger then Shipley government. And the big mistake that was made then is that we didn't spend enough on training, and the people that were on the dole queue during that period ended that period of unemployment without further skills and on the habit of sitting on their bums at home, and they didn't have a work habit. She said that this budget needed to be judged in terms of what it was going to do for training of that large cohort of our young people in New Zealand who are currently unemployed. And what this budget does is just about nothing. Just about nothing. So rather than increasing the amount that's going into training, we have a government that's setting quotas on the number of people that can go to university. People are being excluded from being university, and we haven't got an increase of funding for training for those people who, through no fault of their own, because of the state of the economy, are stuck on the dole. What this budget does in terms of debt is that the amount that's going to be spent on interest on government debt goes from $2.5 billion per annum to $5 billion per annum, $5.5 billion per annum. That's a big increase in the amount of our taxes that's being spent on interest. What it does in terms of the current account deficit is woeful. We hear the government saying that we're going to rebalance the economy towards exports. What does this budget show? It shows the current account deficit going up every year from now on. The current account deficit goes up to 7% of GDP. 7% of GDP. How is that proof of rebalancing the economy? It is not. It is proof of return to a deficit-based economy, so much weighted towards the property sector with not enough exporting. And this budget does not solve that problem. The effect of that is that by 2014, New Zealand's total net assets as a country, including both government and private debt, rise to 100% of GDP. 100% of GDP. So rather than that going in the right direction, the deficits that the government's doing, the lack of movement of the economy towards the productive sector and exports means that total net assets go to negative 100% of GDP. Now, lastly, I'm going to mention the fact that the position of the government and the country would be even worse were it not for the fact that the last government did reduce debt. Bill English and John Key every time said tax cuts, not surpluses. That would have led to more inflation, it would have led to higher interest rates, and it would have led to higher debt than this current government inherited, and New Zealand would have been closer to the position of Greece and Great Britain and the old National Party government when they after Muldoon, let debt at 80% of GDP. Instead, we reduced net debt to 17% of GDP. Gross debt to 17% of GDP, net debt to 0% of GDP. The government's got it going in the other direction. They have not rebalanced the economy. They have not rebalanced the economy. The tax cuts will be eaten up for all but the most wealthy people in the extra costs that they're going to face in rent and inflation for their food costs. But overall, the thing that's worst about this budget is that it breaks three promises.
I'm sorry to interrupt the member. His time has expired. The Honourable Tariana Turia.
Mr Speaker, in Māoridom we have te pō uri